All right, welcome in everybody to another interview. I am honored to be in the presence of Professor Fabio Rambelli, a leading scholar of Japanese religions and cultural history, whose work has really profoundly reshaped our understanding of Shintoism, Esoteric Buddhism, and their complex entanglements. Professor Rambelli has shown how Shinto has emerged not as an isolated tradition, but through layered interactions between Buddhism, Daoism, Neo-Confucianism, Indian thought, and even Christianity, framing it as both a product of localization and a vehicle of cultural identity. His research combines deep textual analysis with bold theoretical insights, especially on topics like syncretism, semiotics, materiality, and iconoclasm. His current work focuses on Gagaku, bugaku, and particularly the culture of the shoal, not just as an instrument, but as a bearer of religious and cosmological meaning. Alongside his scholarship, he leads a study group that explores these traditions in practice. It is a privilege to speak with a thinker whose work bridges intellectual rigor, historical depth, and living tradition. Welcome in, Dr. Fabio.
Oh, thank you so much, Sean. I mean, this is very, very nice introduction. Too generous.
Well, I'd like to begin with Shintoism and syncretism. Is that okay?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. You've written extensively about Shinto as a constructed discourse, and it's shaped by its entanglement with Buddhism, Confucianism, and other traditions. Do you
Hmm.
see this as undermining the claims of Shintoism as a native Japanese religion, or is it nativeness itself a rhetorical invention?
Hmm. That's a difficult question. Um, you see, okay, the question is for me, so I'll give you my answer, but I'm aware that, people can look at these things from this question from different perspectives. Some people, especially in Japan, may be affectionate to a certain idea of nativism because it relates to their own perceived identity, right? Cultural identity. So if you take that away from them, then you say, hey, you're taking away my, the core of my identity. So that is not my intention. Um, I do believe that all cultural entities are basically constructed, right? There is something that happens, of course, but then people put together all kinds of elements and they come up with a construct and it becomes alive, in the process and it becomes meaningful for them.
Hmm.
And,
Yeah.
throughout history, some of these concepts are just thrown away because they're no longer functioning. Other
Mhm.
concepts are kept, but, modified, they add other. I like to see these things are like Lego blocks, you add like
Mm.
Lego blocks and you make them bigger or smaller, you make them into something else. So I think that this is what happens in the case of Shinto, but I also believe that so Shinto to me is a combination of many different factors, right? Many
Yeah.
different elements. And those elements, like I said, they keep being added or removed or like
Hmm.
placed in a different position, perhaps.
Hmm.
But that is also what makes it native in a way.
Hmm. Mm.
But that is the same for any concept, right? Any cultural construct.
Yeah. And it also
Especially in terms of religions, religions are born somewhere and they move somewhere else, and they become deeply embedded with the culture where they move on. Are they
Mhm.
native? Are they foreign? Where do we draw the line? How long does it take to make them native after they come from somewhere else? So this is the how I look at things.
Mm. And it's actually very Japanese in a sense because Japanese imports a lot of different cultural ideas and mixes it around and kind of tweaks it to make their own. So that only
Right.
makes sense just as how we see how they function with the rest of the culture that they have.
Right, right. So this is this is a good comment. And again, I would like to distinguish that, in the past people used to say that the Japanese copy, imitate, and they're not, they pick up what they want and they
Mm.
improve, they change them as they not necessarily improve, it depends.
Mm.
But all cultures, not only Japan, all cultures do that. We're talking about Shinto, think about Christianity.
Oh, of course.
Nobody in Europe or in the US think that Christianity is an imported religion, right?
Yeah, they don't think of that, but it's mainly a North African, Middle Eastern religion, and things change and develop as they go into their lands. And there's actually lots of studies that go on about this. Is like how do modern Christians practice in America versus South Africa, and
Right.
they're what they find important and the things that they practice don't make it any less meaningful or any less true, but they're very different, and those differences have to be highlighted because that's the cultural aspects that's so unique about their practice.
Right. And I think that without highlighting those differences and those, constituent elements, then you really don't get what it is, because then everything is either the same
Mm,
or it's inauthentic. But
yes.
you really have to place, that particular construct in the place where it is being used and then see
Hmm.
how it functions with everything else. And that makes it meaningful, I
Mm,
think.
I agree.
So having
D
this kind of like abstract, historical constructs that, Shinto has always been there, is always, that
hmm.
doesn't really help us, because whatever was there 200, 500, 2,000 years ago probably doesn't speak too much anymore, right? To
No,
us
no, not at
anymore,
all.
right?
Yeah, and there's even characters within Shintoism that no longer even exist. I think like it's the Onmyoji, if I'm correct. Like those the courtly magicians don't are no longer around. We have
Right,
we
right, right.
haven't we haven't had one since the 1200s.
No, Myoji, no. Myoji continue until the end of the Edo period.
Oh,
And
really? I had this understanding they were gone like
Oh,
by
you mean the
Sengoku.
court, as court bureaucrats? You see, the office formally continues until the end of the Edo period,
Oh,
but of
okay.
course you don't have the same practitioners. But then Omyoji become kind of private entrepreneurs, or they become affiliated with the Buddhist temples or Shinto shrines, and in that capacity they continue their activities
Yeah, because
until the end of the. But then the Meiji government prohibits them.
oh, I
So,
see.
yeah, and so yeah.
So this is actually a good point to maybe clarify in my own understanding because my understanding was that there was such a lack of positions to be filled for that role because they didn't marry, they couldn't take like becoming a disciple was very difficult for being a court magician that a lot of the Shingon and Tendai priests became that role and they did like kind of a dual position post Heian era. Would that be fair to say, or is that a
Yeah.
distortion?
I think there are many causes why the office of imperial divination ceases to exist, or ceases to function. Um, I'm not sure that intermarriage was really a major issue. The problem is
Hmm.
that the entire imperial bureaucracy by the 10th century is
Mm,
pretty much emptied of its functionality. It's just like titles on paper,
mm,
because the government is no longer able to raise taxes and therefore is no longer able to pay or
hmm.
to do anything. So they keep the structure, the frame in place, but then it's kind of emptied from within, and other agents, other people, other groups end up playing the same or similar or functions. This is very
Mm,
clear, for example, in the case of the court musicians. The
mm,
Gagaku was another office similar to the office of divination. And when the court is unable to sustain that, like pretty much all the other
mm,
offices, the musicians create their own kind of semi-private organizations,
mm,
either affiliated with temples or still affiliated with the imperial court, but then they are supported by individual stipends. So, like the aristocrats, for example, or
mm,
the household of the imperial family
mm,
pays for them.
mm.
That, of
Very,
course,
yeah.
in a way reduces their role at court, and they begin to play other functions at temples and shrines, for example, so they
Mm,
become something else. So again, the families are the same, the instruments are the same, the repertoire is the same, but they play a different social role. And so the same, I think, happens with the Omyoji.
oh,
I would not
okay.
call them magicians. They were like experts in divination, in
Mm.
calendar, in
So
in
is it closer to kind of uh like the kind of the same Chinese court of divination and like the Taoist sense?
Yeah, yeah. It was not really Taoist either. I mean, because that's widespread all over all over Chinese thought.
Hmm.
If anything, they are Confucians. But
Mm.
basically, these are like experts in the control of space and time.
Yes, yes. The
Uh,
relation between the celestial world and the physical world.
right,
Yeah.
exactly. Or like determining particular places where to do particular things, or
Mm.
determine like the hour when to do particular rituals. So in
Hmm.
that sense, and they're also kind of able to prognosticate, right, based on what happens in the stars or what happens in other
Hmm.
another component. Because of the law of analogy, they're able to determine. perhaps the future or perhaps the causes, that are unknown at the present. So
Hmm.
I really like to call them experts because, in a way, experts of space and time because they were the scientists or were applying the science at the time. They were not applying like any superstitious component or any like conspiracies or anything, That was the science at the time that was based on this law of correlations, similar to what the Pythagoreans had in Europe or what,
Yeah, yeah, even
the
in the
Renaissance system of signatures and analogies.
yeah, and reading the skies was a very common theme. It's like even seeing like even in the Bible when it says that I see a dragon falling from the sky, right? That's the actual constellation in
Yeah, yeah.
in the stars, not a physical dragon that we kind of see actually falling from the sky. But
Yeah, yeah. Well, okay,
yeah.
some people may have seen that
Yeah.
as a physical dragon. I mean, that I don't know, but certainly this idea that there is a correspondence between different planes of reality is
Yeah.
a was a widespread concept, pretty much in many cultures, and certainly throughout Eurasia.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
And then,
And
so in that sense, the Omyoji were the applied, how do you call applied scientists, those who
yeah.
applied sciences out of these metaphysical theories.
I guess that brings us to the category of religion. And do you think that
Hmm.
that category of it shapes or distorts our understanding of Shinto, especially when it tends to be framed in opposition to Buddhism in our modern discourse?
I think it does, in a way, hinder the understanding of what Shinto may have been in pre-modern times, before the Meiji, before the idea of religion, Shukyo, was even imported in Japan.
Hmm.
Um, there are some scholars that are also arguing that the idea of religion is really a modern invention also in the West, in the way we understand it now. The idea
Yeah.
that there is a separation between the physical world and the kind of spiritual world that happens, in our hearts, in our minds.
Hmm.
Which is in a way a consequence of the Protestant Reformation also, this emphasis on belief and people that, have to understand and believe certain scriptures, certain texts.
Hmm.
That never really applied to Shinto or even to Buddhism in many ways.
Yeah.
And so applying this concept that kind of presupposes this clear cut, this very obvious separation between what is visible, what is present, and what is in our hearts, for example, in our
Hmm.
spirits. I don't think that applies to any pre-modern religion, also in the West, by the way, but certainly in
Hmm.
the case of Japan, that is clear. That's why many Japanese are so reluctant in using the term Shukyo for what
Hmm.
they're doing when they visit Buddhist temples or Shinto shrines, because they say this is not really what we do, what we think it is, right?
Yeah, I hear the word shugyo a lot more than I ever hear shukyo. Right? If you think
Yeah,
shukyo, I
yeah, yeah.
usually think of something like tendikyo, or maybe even more in the face of like if like if it was one of the Buddhist schools, maybe like Jodo Shinshu would be much more of like a shukyo in that sense
Shukyo.
because of its faith. But even then, I don't think they use those words because what I hear more often is shugyo.
Yeah,
It's a practice than it is than an actual belief in a
but
faith.
but Shugyo is I think probably a translation that I like is like self-cultivation
Yeah.
and or a mode of cultivation, and that applies to religious practices, right? But to
Yeah.
interactions with the divine, but it also applies to musical instruments, right? It applies when
Exactly.
you are a sushi maker and you do Shugyo
Yep.
to learn the art of sushi making.
Hmm.
So in that sense, I think religion, the category of religion is limiting because you can have an interaction with the sacred or the divine, but without having um, an organized framework, and a set of rules that somebody else has set up for you, or like
Mm.
a religious or a religious specialist, let's put it this
Mm.
way, have prepared for you.
Mm.
The interaction with the divine can happen in many different fields of ordinary life.
Hmm.
There's no particular place or particular moment when that can happen. It can
Hmm.
happen in many other situations. So I think this is in line with the pre-modern understanding of what, again, Shinto and Buddhism also, were.
Mm.
That were like integral part of everyday life and not necessarily what we now would consider as religious.
Mm. So then, speaking about Buddhism, what do you think has been the most misunderstood concept or idea inside esoteric Buddhism in Western scholarship, specifically on terms of philosophical and ritual sophistication?
Oh. Well, I think the understanding of esoteric Buddhism has changed widely throughout the ages, right? The first Buddhist scholars, like in the 1800s, they saw that, especially as Tantric Buddhism,
Hmm.
as a horrible degeneration of the purity of original Buddhism, because these people were doing magic, they were doing rituals. We don't do
Hmm.
that. Religion is based on pure belief. That's what they said. Then later on, they began to see the complexity of the philosophical articulations, behind the ritual activities and behind the iconography,
Hmm.
the incredibly rich iconography of esoteric Buddhism. And so that has changed the understanding. To me, really, esoteric Buddhism is one of the richest, the most like really deep and richly articulated formulations of Buddhism in many different aspects, beginning with metaphysics, beginning with ontology, the structure of reality, for example, a finely articulated theory of the mind, theory of like epistemology, theory of knowledge, for example,
Hmm.
and how those ideas that are very abstract, obviously, how they apply in a process of salvation.
Yeah, and I'm really thinking, like, especially we're talking about the philosophy of the mind, like Kukai's Juju Shinron comes to
Right.
mind, right? And this is the 10 stages of a person's mind, and he kind of goes in detail about the philosophy of how one develops, and the amount of writings that Kukai has is
Yeah.
astounding. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
you kind of wonder, when did the guy not only sleep, but when did he eat? He's just constantly has the fude in the hand.
Yeah, no, that's right. And and but you see, his later followers, like other Shingon Buddhist monks that are mostly forgotten today, except for very few scholars. I mean, they wrote even more.
Mm.
They wrote like I don't know, like dozens of scrolls of commentaries on Kukai's works or on the scriptures, or someone. Yanaga Nobumi in particular has talked about this textual asceticism, that for them, right, writing text, writing commentaries was a form of asceticism, was a form of Buddhist practice, a devotion to the word of the Buddha and the word of the masters. And I think that this captures, Yanaga-san captures some of the essence of this, you
Mm.
know. The other aspect of that is that a lot of the texts that you have mentioned and also that I've been talking about, a lot of them are like lecture notes,
Oh yeah, yeah.
which means they were lecturing because they were giving lectures on these subjects, and they were writing down the notes, they were writing down the questions that they got from the students,
Mhm.
and so they keep changing their notes over a long, sometimes several years, and until they get a sense that, okay, this is it, I cannot add any more to that. And
Mhm.
then they package it, and they created a text that then was available for copying.
Yeah, and I find that to be really interesting because also in the West, that tended to be the tradition too. That when we see a lot of these volumes of books, it wasn't that they were just sitting down and writing them, but they're actually lecture notes of these, famous theologians and scholars, and they would be teaching courses over, 20, 30 years. And so all of the
Yeah,
notes that the students amassed became the volume of works, body of works at the end of their life. Or
absolutely. Yeah.
posted throughout. So it really is incredible because you're not just reading the person's thoughts, you're actually reading the, like, as if you took the college or the seminary or the religious studies courses of that day.
Yeah, yeah. And then you also see the development of this person's thought, right? During
Yes. Yeah. And how they.
sometimes a long span of time. But you've been talking about categories at the beginning, right? And we today we have the category of the author as somebody, sits down and writes the book from the beginning to the end, adds the
Yes.
cover, the final page, and that is a book. That was never the case, right? You
Hmm.
have people talking to other people and coming back with this kind of collective effort. And then
Hmm.
you have the copies sometimes adding their own comments, right? And then they end up in the
Yeah.
copies, and
Yeah.
and so you really see that knowledge is a collective endeavor, right? And a lot
Absolutely.
of people participate. It's not really the the genius, sits
Yeah.
down and
Yeah,
creates the.
there's no soloist in philosophy in this sense.
Not really. I
Uh,
mean, yeah, there are people who have a stronger voice, perhaps, right? In the
mhm.
orchestra, but still, you need an orchestra to create
That's right.
to create a philosophy.
Now, we mentioned a little bit about those icons, especially like the mandalas, the huge. I mean, if
Mm.
people don't know what we're talking about with the mandalas, you have to search up the Shingon Buddhist mandalas and look at the descriptions of them and what all the characters mean because it's like it's an entire dissertation for one mandala.
Yeah, yeah.
So how does materiality, the ritual objects, icons, and sounds function differently in Mikyo than other Buddhist traditions, especially in terms of the efficacy and the cosmology?
That is a very good and also very difficult question because my sense is that in most Buddhist traditions in Japan, the icons work pretty much in the same way.
Hmm.
In the sense that when you have an image, first of all, the image is consecrated, which means that the divinities that are described can be one, it can be two, it can be 200, right? Like in the
Yes.
Shingon mandalas. The divinities are invoked upon and enter the image. So the image is really animated, which
Hmm.
is similar to the icons, in the Orthodox tradition, is similar to, sacred objects in many other religious traditions. So this is a crucial aspect because the images that we see at museums, and that
Hmm.
is the most obvious place where we see them, those are not consecrated. Those are just
Now, are they invocations or are they windows to the celestial world?
So they're both. So first of all, the divinities are invoked, and therefore they abide in the image, and as such, the image, the icon becomes a portal to the divine world. Well, what is called in Buddhism like the invisible, what is invisible to us, but is
Yeah, yeah.
present here. So in that sense, they are very important entities, and they are animated. I mean, this is not really magic or animism. I mean, it's really how it works, that we need a portal that puts us in touch with this realm of the Buddhas that we cannot see with the naked eye. And so those images were used in rituals when again the efficacy of the divinity was invoked.
Mm, hmm.
Right, and so the divinity is in Buddhism, especially in pre-modern Buddhism, is never transcendent, living in a different realm beyond space and time, like the monotheistic gods, for example. The
Hmm.
Buddhas are here in this universe. There's no other universe. There's no other place
Yeah.
to be. But when you want to, so they're here, but we just cannot see them because our sense organs are limited, and our understanding is limited. So these particular divine sacred images are what enables us to make them visible and also to bring them here to this world.
Hmm.
And there are scriptural bases for that. There are all very some of the earliest Buddhist scriptures talk about the
Hmm.
process in which these images are created and the consecration rituals that are necessary. So this applies to pretty much all Buddhist traditions in Japan. The mandala is a bit more complicated because you have the mandala is a kind of a description of the world as it appears to the Buddha
Hmm.
after attaining enlightenment. So we don't see the world in this way, but the Buddha sees that in that way. And therefore that helps us understanding the structure of reality, the ontology of the universe,
Hmm.
and how the salvific power of the Buddha works.
Hmm.
And so the two mandala that you have described at the beginning, so one is kind of well, the squares, right, the concentric squares.
Hmm.
The outermost square is really the realm of the unenlightened beings. And the closer you get to the center, which is the cosmic Buddha, the closer you get to enlightenment. So that represents the itinerary that sentient beings, us, have to, engage towards achieving the stage of the Buddha. The other one with the nine squares,
Hmm.
the second mandala, that represents the opposite movement is the wisdom of the Buddha that gets spread out in a spiral to
Hmm.
all the realm, all the areas in the universe.
Hmm.
So it is a dual movement. It's the sentient beings progressing towards the Buddha, but it's also the wisdom of the Buddha that is kind of spread out in wider and wider circles, spirals, to everybody. Without one movement, you cannot have the other one. I mean, that is the understanding. So
Right.
they are separate, of course, but they're also connected.
And for those who are curious about what he means by the cosmic Buddhist, he's referring to Daiichi Nyorai, which is the main
Right,
Buddha, especially in Shingon Esoteric
right,
Buddhism.
right. Which is important to also mention that the Buddha, so we tend to see the Buddha as a humanoid form, right? Like a
Yes.
statue, like an image. But in esoteric Buddhism, Dainichi Nyorai is in fact the universe itself.
Hmm.
So this is really the radical transition that esoteric Buddhism, especially in Japan, promotes. I mean that whatever we have in the universe,
Hmm.
that is Dainichi Nyorai.
Would you call it a type of pantheism?
Yes, you can call it that way, absolutely, because again, there's nothing outside of it, and the divinity pervades everything.
Hmm.
It's not like divinities in the plural. I mean, that is really one entity that is multiple. This is how they describe it, actually.
Yeah.
It's multiple, but it's at the same time one large
Uh, so
unit.
they do have a solution for the problem of the one and the many because they're both.
In fact, you have the idea of the Ichi Hokkai and Ta Hokkai. The Hokkai being the
Yeah.
coming out of the Dharma unit. And so Ichi is, so it's kind of unified, is one thing, right?
Hmm.
But at the same time, it's Ta, multiple.
Yes.
And yeah, and there are different arguments of how these two different levels fit together. So
Mm.
there's no unified theory in Shingon, but they're aware of because there's multiplicity in the world. They don't deny that.
Hmm.
But the question is, how do we bring together the multiplicity into the unity of the cosmic
Yeah,
Buddha?
and that's the famous philosophical question of the problem of the one and the many. So I'd be into. I've never read the Ihokai and the Tahokai, right? I haven't read those things. So I'd be really interested to read those and see what their answer is for that.
Yeah,
It's
I have a
really
couple of pages in my book on Buddhist semiotics where I try to describe all of this, but I was trying to explain, but it's really complicated.
and what makes it difficult, and I think this is the sort of for some reason when we have a view of something, we learn about whatever. Let's say it might be like the Catholic Church, or let's say it's Eastern Orthodoxy, or it's African tribal things. We tend to want to view them as a monolith that everybody agrees the same way, but it's not. There's actually multiple schools within inside the Catholic Church, within inside the Eastern Orthodox traditions, as well as in tribal practices of Africa. Even in the musical world, you have violin schools, you have the Russian school, the German school, the American
Absolutely.
school, and no one has a monolithic view. Even in those, you can call subgroups. So it's really fascinating to hear as well that even at like the most important elements, the actual um, grounding of their understanding in Mikkyo Shingon Buddhism, there are disagreements on what makes up their ontos.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So of course, they have an agreement of the larger picture, but how that works in practice
Yeah.
or how you can articulate it, then they have multiple, that's how the branches or the sub-schools, for example, are based on this kind of differences in this. Well, some people might think these are details, but for them, those are the crucial differences,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. Absolutely. It can make it's a huge difference, and I definitely understand that coming from a religious background as well.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And the other basis for the multiplication of branches or sub branches of sub schools is ritual. How do we do this particular ritual? And again,
Mm.
those are minor difference. Do we do this mudra or that mudra? For me, it's the same, but for them, it's really important, right?
Do you find at least in how I kind of see a lot of modern scholarship too, is I see a lot of sentimentalization when they see ritualization. Do you think that that's a warranted belief, or do you think that's kind of a romantic kind of rose-tinted glasses view of the ritualized practices?
Actually, I think you see both, right? Some people see in that so they have a kind of romanticization because you say again, it's connected to authenticity, right? That is
Sure.
the original way to do things, and these masters know how to control these forces and all that. But I also see the opposite, that that is kind of a debunking thing, They
Hmm.
do that,
Hmm.
but it doesn't really mean, or they don't mean it, or they go through the motions, as they say.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
And to me, ritual is never going through the mo. It can be boring,
Mm.
obviously, right, to everybody, but it's not really. I mean, if they do it, it means it's because it is important, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And so the degree of importance and or the meaning, the significance of the ritual, I mean, that can vary according to the person. I mean, you can have somebody who's very, very informed and they know why they're doing it and why they're doing it that way. Or you have like general participants who are just bored because they don't know what's going on, but still they
Yeah,
know that they have to do it. But again, that applies to all rituals, not only religious, but all kind of common general practices where people have to stand and listen to someone, right?
yeah, yeah,
There are these conventions that you have to accept. They say, why this guy speaks for like 40 minutes, something
yeah.
like,
Yeah,
and
we
why do you have to stand here listening to this guy?
I invited my friend to a tea ceremony. It was at Kasuga Taisha, and it's
Oh, oh,
one
yeah,
of the biggest shrines in Japan. Very very
right.
famous. And I didn't tell him what kind of tea ceremony it was, but once he arrived, he's like, oh, "Dude, why?" Because he knew that we were gonna watch somebody make tea, one cup of tea for an hour, and so and then
Just
he's
want to drink tea, right?
I was like,
But that's not the goal of the.
I just want to drink my tea. But I was like, no, you have to sit and suffer for an hour, and then we can go have some tea. But
But that's why I think the rituals are not really for everyone.
yeah,
Again, we tend to see because again that is not a mass where the congregation gathers, and the mass can be very boring too, right? If you allow me to say that, it really depends on.
yeah, for me, like even though I'm not Catholic or Orthodox, I really enjoy the processions and the music and the formality of all of it, and it's why I like Shingon music so much because it's really highly developed. It's very beautiful, and it's intoxicating because of just how
Yeah.
gorgeous the music is. So I totally understand it, but then for someone who doesn't have the music background, they just go, it just sounds like a bunch of loud voices. So
Right, right. So again, you have to find the meaning or the significance in what is going on, and then you hold on to that, right? And for
yeah.
some people, it can be really the liturgy can be beautiful in itself, right? Because you have
Hmm.
the religion, the sacred secrets are being revealed in front of you. For others, it will be like the vestments, or it will be the music, or it can be anything else, right?
Yes, yes.
But for some people, it's just boring because you have to wait there for an hour, and none of that is interesting to you.
Hmm.
So I think that in that sense, the romanticization of ritual is a problem because it presupposes that ritual is beautiful or important for everyone involved. It is
Hmm.
not really.
Hmm.
And it was not in the past, although probably in the past more people were more used to the type of ritual action, probably. We don't really have the data, so sometimes thinking about the past also comes with romanticization, right? What I
Yeah.
just said. In the past, people knew better or knew more. Maybe it's not even true.
Yeah, we did our wedding in Japan. We actually did it at Hasida's Busanham, the
Oh,
school.
beautiful there.
Yeah,
Oh, that's
it's such a gorgeous place, and I
beautiful. Yeah.
yeah, and it was a wonderful wedding. My
And their
teacher.
shiomyo is amazing there, actually.
That my teacher is one of the shomyoka at
Oh,
there. So I worked with him for years, and I learned so much, and it's absolutely gorgeous. I think that my personal bias, that's the best shomyo in the world right there.
I
But
think
there's
you're right, actually.
yeah, it's great stuff.
Yeah.
And well, there's a story that, Seisho Nagon used to go there often and stand on that deck that looks out over all of the trees and the foliage, and you get the romantic image of her standing there and writing poetry. You're like, oh, this place is so incredible. But then you start to romanticize because it wasn't just necessarily that she was going there for the purposes that you think she was going there for. There was other reasons to be going there. And
Yeah.
sometimes they weren't always the purest of intentions either.
And what
So,
she writes is probably kind of filter, right? I mean, she didn't
oh
write
yeah.
everything that she wanted to,
Oh, they were
or she
catty.
wished that she could have
Oh
write.
yeah. She's like, I'm here. I'm trying to put a hex on somebody because I need this bit. She needs to die. So yeah, it was fun stuff in Japanese history. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
so I want to move to Gagaku, Bugaku, especially the show. So your current
Okay.
project is on Gagaku and the show. It's really fascinating stuff. What drew you to music as a site of religious and intellectual history?
Hmm. That is okay. I always loved music, and I played music since I was in like junior high. I
Hmm.
played saxophone, so I'm on the kind of the jazz, popular music side,
Sure.
not so much in classical music. Although I have been listening to contemporary music since again I was in high school. Um, so this is one thing that I really love and enjoy doing. And then I've been working on again, Japanese religions for many years. Gagaku, at some point, became the intersection of the two. So
Mm.
the passion for music and the interest, the passion to study, to understand more about, the religious culture of Japan. So Gagaku as the ceremonial music, again, not only of the imperial palace, because that's how it is, marketed today, but Gagaku really starts with the large Buddhist temples of Japan.
Hmm.
Already by the 500, 600, apparently Shotoku Taishi, there is this legend. It's apocryphal. It's probably not true, but Shotoku Taishi is the one who um imported Gagaku and placed it in Shitennoji, and that's how it started. And then the court then followed up and picked it
Hmm.
up too. Whether that is true or not, but for sure, by the Nara period in the 700s, all the large temples in Nara had their own orchestra.
Mm.
Which one, was, and there was one also at the Imperial Palace, because of the Chinese system, the Office of Music and Dance. And then I guess the temples were no longer able to sustain an orchestra each because
Yeah.
of the dwindling support from the state and so forth. So they were disbanded. And so one at Shitennoji remained, the other one was consolidated at Kofuji Kasuga in
Hmm.
Nara.
Yep.
And the third one remained at the Imperial Palace, but again, he was also servicing temples in the Kyoto area.
Mhm.
So, so the ceremonial music is not only for the emperor or for the Shinto shrines, which did not exist at the time because they were all Buddhist temples,
Yep.
but it was like a liturgical music for interactions with the divine and with the sacred. So
Mm.
this is how the two things, the passion for music and the passion for, the interest for Japanese religions got together for me. Then the next step was, because you can read this in books. Then I really started learning the show and I said, wow, this is beautiful. I just loved it.
Mm.
And so that became my main instrument, rather than the saxophone and learning the show implied learning the standard, the classical repertoire
Hmm.
of Gagaku. And then I discovered that there are contemporary composers writing for the show. They've been
Yeah.
writing since the 80s. And so I began to study the contemporary compositions, which is a lot of fun because some of them are really challenging because the techniques the way they think about the instrument is very different from the classical, the Gagaku
Absolutely.
instrument. I'm sure that with the shakuhachi is the
Yeah,
same.
we share that same passion. I commission lots of composers to write new music.
You see, yeah, and then the third step was since I've been playing jazz since I was like in middle school, so try to see if I can use the show as an improvising instrument
Mm.
and applying it to this type of, free jazz or like I cannot really play standards with the show, but
Mm.
playing like more improvised music with an improvisation that does not derive for contemporary music, but it derives from the jazz and free jazz tradition, with the
Mm.
swing, with a particular accent and so forth. And so this is what I've been doing in the last 2 or 3 years. I
Hmm.
even have a CD out, with the
Ah,
Belgian drummer where
wonderful.
we play these kind of wild things. So this is how these different things, these passions and academic interests, got
Mhm.
together into one thing. And to me, this is so satisfying, so late in my
Mm.
career, I can say
Now
that I've
you
been able to bring together these two passions of mine that have been cultivated since I was, like again,
mm.
a teenager, basically, right?
Now you did say something that was really interesting. You said that the Shinto shrines didn't exist yet,
Oh
and
yeah, maybe that was an exaggeration, but let me, I
yeah,
can explain.
but yeah, because there's a lot of truth to that in one sense, and I think it's one of the distortions of that when we see a Shinto shrine, we think, oh, this has been here for thousands and thousands of years before human records, and I think I would like that to be cleared up just a little bit before we go a little bit further into Gagaku.
Yeah, so it is clear. I mean, I'm not making it up. It is in the historical sources and all that, right? There were kami, of course, and spirits in Japan before the arrival of Buddhism, before the arrival of any other
Yes.
things. So the kami were worshipped apparently in the open, in a
Hmm.
temporary structure. So maybe there was not even a building, or maybe it was like just a simple hut or something. Or very often it was just an altar where the offering was placed outside. And those places seem to have been like the Iwasaka, like rocks, basically, kind of a rock garden, something like that. And that's where the divinity was invoked, celebrated, worshipped, and then sent off back to wherever they abide, where they exist. So this seems to have been kind of the. We know very little about that, in fact, because most of it comes from archaeological reconstructions that are very shaky in themselves, because again, we don't have a lot of textual evidence for that. But when
Does some of this also come from like the Chronicles of Wa, like that early third century Chinese document? But also,
they
and
don't really say, you mean the wage, yeah, the Book of Way. Um, They do mention shamanism, they do mention something, but they're not very detailed in terms of the
mm,
specific practices that they have. It's really a few pages, literally, that they
mhm.
that they wrote about all this. We don't even know where the people that the Chinese chronicles describe are. There are several theories. Could have been northern Kyushu, could have been like the
Yeah,
Sea of Japan, could have been so we don't even know if those are representative of the entire archipelago.
sure.
But what they found is that there are these groups of rocks, and separate in a place where there are no other, like round rocks or something, in places where there are no other rocks. So those are must have been made for particular reasons. And there is this idea that Iwasaka is the place where the gods appear and so forth. That is probably mentioned also in Manyo, Shunkojiki, and these very early texts in a very vague form.
Hmm.
So Buddhism brought like buildings, and so what happened, like pretty much everywhere in Asia, the Buddhists, before they built the temple, they pacified the local gods, the local spirits in the land of the temple.
Hmm.
And that's what they did in Japan. So they enshrined whatever they thought was the spirit there in the where they built the temples. They made a building also for that. In Japan, there was already around the in Nara first in Kyoto, there were families that were specialized in performing rituals for the kami in association with the emperor, well, with
Hmm.
the rulers. So those families kept doing their own thing in buildings that were part of Buddhist complexes.
Hmm.
So in that sense, there was no separate, no individual Shinto religion at all. I mean, everything was part of Buddhism.
Hmm.
Even if you look in the Kamakura period, Muromachi period, a lot of the legends or documents or theories about the kami were written by Buddhist priests.
Mm.
Shinto priests were really specialists in the interactions with the kami. They didn't really write theories about the
Hmm.
kami. That
Mm,
is
I
something
see.
that the Buddhists did because they were the specialists in this. I mean, the philosophical specialists in the
Mm.
in the sacred. So in that sense, even the first Buddhist, some of the first temples in Japan were called Jinguji, right? Is a
Ah,
temple
interesting.
where you worship a kami.
Huh.
But they worship a kami, so the Buddhist temple, was built so that the people could pray, the Buddhas, to save the kami, because a kami as a god is part of the cycle of transmigration. So the kami die and are reborn and they
Mm.
suffer. And so, which is an idea that it's strange to us because the Greek gods are, they don't die,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
the Roman gods, right? Whereas the Indian gods do die. Brahma,
Hmm.
Shiva, they die in the early forms of Hinduism at the time in which Buddhism was developing. So the Buddhists, pick up that idea, they bring it to Japan, and they build these temples to pacify and save the kami. And then the kami become protectors of Buddhism.
Mm.
So, so in that sense, there was no Shinto, and there were no Shinto shrines as independent entities. They all belonged to temples, or they were Buddhist temples themselves. The things begin to change in the Edo period when some of these kami structures, with the clergy specialized in them, and they were not Buddhist monks, they
Mm.
begin to claim their independence. They say, we are not really doing anything Buddhist. We should
Mm.
be our own thing. One of the first one is Izumo.
Mm,
The Grand Shrine of Izumo is one of the first one to declare independence. And Ise was also an exception because it didn't have a controlling temple.
mm,
Ise has always been two different shrines with a lot of multiple shrines. And by the way, the Ise priests, when they died, they had a Buddhist funeral and they had a Buddhist temple to take care of them.
hmm.
They didn't do Buddhist funerals until late Edo period.
You mean they into Shinto?
The Shinto priests,
Yeah,
they didn't do Shinto funerals. Yeah,
yeah,
they
yeah.
did Buddhist funerals like pretty much everybody else.
Mm,
So in the Edo period, like I said, you begin to see a movement of separation, but it was only very limited and localized, whereas most other what are now Shinto shrines, like I said, were either part of a Buddhist temple in a
mm,
compound or was a Buddhist temple itself.
mm,
So in that sense,
yeah. So moving it back to Gagaku then,
yeah.
do you see Gagaku as like a form of liturgy, an aesthetic ideology, or a political theory, or maybe even just all three of those in one?
There are all three of those in one, actually, and maybe each part is magnified or reduced based on the context.
Mm.
So at court and with the samurai, because the samurai in the Edo period also pick up Gagaku as their own liturgical ceremonial music, in Edo.
Yes.
And so for them, that is one of the components of statecraft,
Mm.
because that is based on Confucianism. The system of rites in Confucianism presupposes music.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so music has to be performed when the rites are being performed,
Hmm.
rites for the ancestors and right, in favor of the sovereign. So in that sense, Gagaku is a central component of statecraft, and that's why the shogun pick it up, because it's
Mm.
necessary to assert their own legitimacy as rulers. The liturgical element is again important because even in at the imperial court and for the shogun, when you do so some of the services that the rituals that we're doing were for the ancestors of the shogun or the emperor or the ancestors of the daimyo, and so that is a liturgy in itself, right? So the music is something that is performed to gratify, to please the ancestors.
Mm.
And the same happens at the Buddhist temples, where Gagaku and Bugaku are offerings, to the Buddhas and the kami.
Hmm.
The aesthetic component is very clearly visible since the Heian period when you have people like Sei Shonagon and others writing, how beautiful this music is, how
Mm.
otherworldly is, and how, they write it. I heard this, I saw this performance, I heard this music. It made me think of the Pure Land. I mean, that this is what the Pure Land might sound like,
Hmm.
something like that. So there is this really enhanced um, we, aesthetic experience, which I can totally relate to because, once you overcome the difference in the music codes, that, once you begin to like the music, and then you see these beautiful costumes, you see the stage, you see
Mm.
these amazing instruments,
Mm.
and this rich tapestry of sounds, that are combined
Yes.
in so many ways. I mean, this is really an amazing experience. Now, if you play it, it's even more so, right? If
Oh
you're
yeah.
there in the middle of the orchestra and you're
Mm.
kind of you can barely hear yourself in the orchestra. Gagaku is very noisy, right, as you know.
Yeah.
And so you really become one little component of this larger kind of mesocosmic entity,
Mm.
right? This
Mm.
relation
Mm.
between the
Mm.
individual and the universe.
That's right.
So there is certainly there is an aesthetic experience there.
Mm.
So I hope I'm answering your question
Oh
because I
yeah.
think that these
Yeah.
three different level, and again, the musicians in the Middle Ages, in the Kamakura period, are aware of all of this.
Hmm.
When they write their treatise, when their books about music, they emphasize all of these aspects. Of
Hmm.
course, they are musicians, so for them, the liturgical aspect and the aesthetic component is more important. But at the same time, they're also aware that they are participating or they are enabling even the emperor or the shogun to function as such.
Yeah. Now, in the show's case, there's a lot of complexity with its symbolic associations. And how do you approach its study without reducing it to just pure function or to an esoteric abstraction?
Hmm.
I see. I knew I could. I had. So for everybody else to know, I've talked with Dr. Rambelli before this, so I knew I could throw all the really hard questions at him because he'd do such a great job with it. So,
No, these are hard questions. I mean, it takes time for me to think about a succinct way to put it. But
mm,
what I do, I read the sources,
mm,
and I first of all I respect them. I don't say that is BS. That is not true. Of course, we
yeah,
know
yeah.
better now.
Hmm.
Um, so going back to the okay, so first of all, no, let's go back when I told about the cosmos in which everything is interrelated. You have the analogies, things that reverberate
Hmm.
between one order of reality and the other. This is the world in which the musicians in the Middle Ages were living.
Mm,
I don't think that they question that. Like we don't question physics today. We don't question the
sure.
theory of like whatever it's called, Newtonian physics of
Hmm.
gravity or anything, right? So for them, it was obvious that certain colors correspond to certain seasons, they correspond to certain planets, they correspond to certain parts of the body, and so forth.
Yeah.
That everybody knew that, right?
Hmm.
Some people were experts in that, some people just knew about it, but that's it. So that is the assumption. So
Hmm.
you have a cosmos in which everything reverberates, and music is part of that. Music is one of the elements in which, that can interact with the other, resonate literally with the other analogous components of the universe.
Mm,
Now, the show is interesting to me in multiple ways because, according to the legends, there is this goddess in China, Nuwa, Joka in Japanese. This
mm,
goddess is one of the very early gods that come to Earth and bring order to chaos, and they introduce civilization.
mm, hmm.
Some of these gods brought like introduced agriculture, other introduced like government, other introduced created music. So Joka in Japanese, Nua in Chinese, so she walks around the earth, right? Bringing order, literally, and she sees a bunch of phoenixes, like I think it's 12 or 15, depends on the source, and they're singing all together, these birds.
Mm,
And she says, "Oh, this is so beautiful. I want to make a musical instrument that makes that sound."
mm,
And so she walks. She has to find the right material. So she walks around. She goes to Mount Kunlun, which is a sacred mountain of
yes.
the gods.
Mm, mm,
She picks up the special bamboo pipes, and she makes a show
mm,
with each pipe making a different sound because that's what she heard, with the
mm,
phoenixes. And she also makes the instrument in a way that it looks like a stylized phoenix.
mm.
The show now is hard to get, but the first shows has this long beak that came out like that, and the pipes are up there, like when the phoenix has the wings
Oh,
up
oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
and the legs down. So then the long beak was removed centuries ago, but the main instrument is still the same. So if you think about it, the show is not something that a random guy created randomly just because.
Mm,
This is a goddess who came to Earth to bring civilization and put order in
mm-hmm,
reality. She saw the phoenixes, which are sacred birds. So
mm,
again, it's another dimension of divinity there. Again, this is immanent, it's not a transcendental divinity. It's a divinity that is here in this world, right? The phoenixes. So she makes an instrument out of sacred bamboo from a sacred mountain,
mm,
another layer of divinity. This instrument that reproduces the original sound of the phoenixes, and it also looks like a phoenix.
mm,
So it's not a random human construct, arbitrary. It's
mm,
really so there is this original sound, original occurrence that has been, it's like a photograph, it's like a recording of that thing, right? Of that event in this object, which
mm,
was handed down to humans after that. And
mm,
the humans have kept the tradition alive. So the sounds are the same, the shape is the same. So basically, every time we play the show, we are repeating the occurrence that the goddess saw.
mm.
Do you see where I'm
Oh
where
yeah,
I'm
it reminds me a lot of even the story that's in the Taigen show of the birth of
yeah.
the Hito Yogiri, all of these people going to the mountaintop to hear this golden monkey sing and be enlightened from its experience. And then, of course, the warlord sends soldiers up to kill it. They're all sad. They take its bones, the special bones, and so on. And that specific bone, though, a mythical gust of wind comes by and makes a sound, and they're reminded of the sound of the monkey's voice. So then they build and construct an instrument that's based off the size of its femur to manipulate
So
it.
that
So
that
yeah,
sounds like a variation of the story, right? But again,
yeah,
so I guess in our skeptical age, we think, okay, this first of all is all legend, is all mythology, is not true,
hmm
or it doesn't matter anyway,
hmm
right? But for them, it did matter because again, so music, Gagaku in particular, is not a random human creation. It's
yeah,
something that the gods have created for a purpose, and
hmm
it's the role of the humans and the musician, the professional musicians in particular, to keep that tradition alive.
hmm
Because in a way, that is a way to stop time, because again, you keep repeating this original act of foundation,
mm
right? The original occurrence, the original manifestation of the divine in this world,
mm
which is preserved in the instrument in many different levels. The same is true for all other instruments, as far as I can tell, because the ryuteki is the sound of reproduces the sound of a dragon, right?
yes,
The hichiriki is the kalavinka, the bird of the Buddhist paradise. So again, every time you play it, you're kind of reproducing the soundscape of the Pure Land.
hmm
So there is this kind of the instruments and the sounds originate in the divine world, in the visible realm that we cannot
hmm
see, but they knew it was there. And those are kind of interfaces for us to interact or to bring the invisible here in the visible world.
mm
So, so this is how I approach the instrument. This is interesting to me.
Absolutely. It gives a whole nother depth to the meaning of like that aesthetic characteristic of ma as well, where
Oh, to everything, because
yeah.
again, if you think about the artistic canons, like we mentioned, in the Western music, the idea is that we have to keep improving the instruments and play more and more difficult stuff. And then you have the
hmm
idea that the player, as the virtuoso, is this kind of a superhero, right?
hmm
Who plays better than everybody else. And so this is this assertion of the ego.
Yes.
None of that happens in Gagaku because, again, the best players are those who preserve the tradition as immaculately as possible.
hmm
There's no ego there. In
Yeah.
fact, you erase your ego as much as possible because you want to keep what your teacher taught and what his
Yeah.
teacher taught and what his teacher taught alive for as long as possible. So that
Absolutely.
really changes the way in which music functions and the way in which music is supposed to be perceived and listened to and enjoyed.
Mm.
Right. So all the components, including the Ma, including everything else, is really part of this. Of course, things change, right?
hmm
And the musicians themselves acknowledge that. But the idea is that they're really preserving as best as possible this
mm
original act in which the divine manifested itself
mm.
in this world.
Yeah, I still have so many questions I want to ask you, but we're running out of time. So I want to leave you with one final question, which is looking forward. What are the biggest intellectual or ethical challenges facing scholars of religion and this classical music genre, particularly those who are working in cross-cultural contexts?
There are a lot of those. I mean, this is important. I don't want to oversimplify, so allow me a few more minutes. But
Please.
so some of it, you mentioned ethical challenges. I'm always very careful. I try to be, and I hope I don't overstep. But
Mm,
in respecting the tradition, for me, this is some one of my teachers told me that the show for me is something that the ancestors brought back or kept, and I have the privilege to be able to play it. Maybe
yeah.
not as good as I wish, or not as good, but still, I'm trying to do my best. And to me, that is always in my mind. I don't want to deface it. I don't want to alter the tradition. I have no claims on that. I deeply respect the tradition, and I think that this
Mm,
is an important attitude. At the same time, I'm not a member of the tradition, so I guess I'm free in a way to do something else with it, but
yeah.
always with the sense of deep respect that is owed to this instrument and to
Mm,
their the depositaries of the tradition.
mhm,
Um, this said, I think it is important to to be able to convey to as many people as possible the richness and the depth of the tradition along the lines of what we've been talking here.
Yeah.
Because when to most people in Japan, Gagaku is like well, first of all, it's like a boring music that they do at temples, right?
Yeah.
And some people that is an art form of music that some people enjoy. But this is not art music. It's not like West, it's not like Bach. It's something else. And I think it is
Mm.
really, really crucial to understand what this something else-ness is,
Mm.
because that is deeply related to the Japanese tradition, Japanese culture as a whole. And I would like to avoid oversimplifications. Like I said, Japan has always been like this, or in Japan they have these ideals that are different from ours, and so forth. They
Hmm.
do perhaps, but we can understand, and some of them have been lost. And I think it is important to preserve at least the understanding of what has been lost.
Hmm.
I don't know if
Absolutely.
I'm making my point clear. I mean, there
No,
are there are many, many threads in
I
this
think
kind of. If
being
you,
a practitioner of an instrument where I do a lot of new things as well. Um, one of the things that really resonate with me is not defacing the instrument. Like I refuse to add more holes to my instrument. There's a lot of people who add one 7 hole, 8 hole, 9 hole. I refuse to do it, and it means that there's actually some notes I can't play, especially in the higher registers. But
and you don't play them, right? I mean,
I just don't play them, or I play the adjacent note or something that works instead of it. But I really understand that, even though there's been lots of natural modifications that have happened, but that's been inside the archipelago. It's not me who's making those changes. I want to play what the Japanese have decided as this is what a shakuhachi is, not, oh, well, I'm just going to reinvent it and do something else and whatever. I
yeah,
like to learn
absolutely.
the old ways as well as the new ways of playing that are us on the archipelago as well, and then take that and express that through, a virtuosic piece or whatever. So what you're saying for me as a musician and as a practitioner myself, a shoe giller, as we could say, is
Right.
I really, really resonate with that. So Dr. Rambelli, thank you so much. 本当に感謝いたします. This was a
Yeah.
wonderful interview. Wonderful.
Th- Thanks to you. This was a great opportunity. And I don't know if people listen to me and they want to get in touch, please just reach out to me.
Yep, check out the links below in the description. Take care, everybody.
All right. Thanks so much.